Hello, welcome to our seminar. My name is Aron Benjamin. I am with the Personal Injury and Criminal Law Group here at Science Berlin. This is Adam Abramowitz with our Trust in the States group, and Julie Christopher with our Family Law group. This is Getting Schooled on Sending Your Kids to College. We're here to talk about issues pertaining to insurance, family planning, estates, trusts, and anything else that might pop up in the next hour that we're together. I'm first going to turn to my colleague Julie here, who not only is with the Family Law Department, but is also in the same situation as many of you at the seminar, because
I have one that I just sent off to college and one that I'm going to send off to college next year.
Well, Julie, as someone who has a child in college and a child about to go to college, what are some of the issues that you dealt with in regards to planning for insurance, coverage, and some of the family issues that you dealt with?
Well, in terms of health insurance, each college has its own health insurance plan. And so there are a number of considerations that parents need to be mindful of with regards to health insurance and how it now impacts their adult child. Parents, along with their adult child, need to identify what the types of coverage are that are available for their students. It can be through the university or college that the child is attending. And one of the first things is to compare what's being offered by the college or university to the existing plan that the parent has their adult child covered under. Looking at the cost and how robust the coverage is for those two types of plans, the existing plan and what may be offered through the university. Typically, universities have as the default, you will be covered under the university coverage as a way of ensuring all students have health insurance coverage. The student can opt out of that, but there are specific things the student has to do that the parent will not have access to, and that the student needs to be armed with the information to know how to make good decisions. And so it's a conversation that the student and their parent is having in terms of the type of coverage, what the costs are, and then there are other implications in the context of divorce. When parents are divorced and there's either a court order in place or there's a marital settlement agreement that contemplates the issue of health insurance, who is the subscriber, and what the costs are associated with that.
So let's expand on that for a second. With families who have gone through a divorce or are in the process of separating, what are, in your experience, some of the best practices when the child is about to leave the nest, so to speak, to go to college? What are some of the best practices that you've seen or you've recommended?
Sure. In terms of, the ideal is where both of the parents are communicating with one another in terms of what is the best type of coverage for the family, notwithstanding the fact that they're now living in two households. So in an ideal world, folks that can have that degree of transparency and communication with each other.
That's got to be key, right? Communication.
Super important and oftentimes very difficult because it's a very contentious situation depending on where you are in the process of separation and divorce. But if there is an already existing separation agreement or a marital settlement agreement that has contemplated and resolved the obligations each parent has with regards to the issue of health insurance specifically, then that also will be a consideration, has the potential to be a consideration as their adult child. Now their adult child is going off. Does the parent continue to have the same contractual obligation because they're now over the 18? Certainly do not have access to information from the university's perspective without their adult child taking specific steps to provide information so that the parent has access to information.
So to that point, if child shows up and is already at college now and has filled out paperwork and selects plan one, and now everybody out there hears this great, discussion about what they should be doing, and now they revisit it and it should be plan two or plan three, can they amend it?
Maybe. I think is probably the most accurate answer because it's going to depend on what the contractual obligations are that the person has entered into. So if the student, for example, has unintentionally or inadvertently enrolled in the university health insurance plan, then they can't unring that bell, as they say, but they can end that coverage as long as they're doing it in conjunction with whatever the health insurance policy permits them to do. By the same token, if they want to make sure they're opting out of that coverage, providing information to the school's bursar office, which is where they're going to pay their bill, and providing whatever information showing coverage already exists to the university will be important so that they avoid incurring the expense and then trying to get refunded back from the university, which is a common issue.
So there might be overlap in plans, and certain facilities on campus might only take the campus plan. You might be out of state. Your plan, your family insurance plan,
Precisely.
might not cover certain facilities in those states.
Precisely. It may be more cost effective depending on the type of coverage that the family has, right? Depending on whether it's considered in-network, out-of-network, if it's an HMO, all of those are features that have to be considered and compared to the student that is attending in the current state versus out of state, depending on how robust, if they're going to a university that has a medical school associated with it and its own healthcare system. It's going to be different coverage and different options than if you're going to the small liberal arts college, regardless of whether you're in state or out of state. And those are all important facts and facts specific to the family to make sure their adult student has access to healthcare, because most teenagers are not going to worry about it until they need to go to the hospital because they're sick.
So they absolutely need to know. Right. One of the, Adam, one of the things that I think is going to be a theme of the next 45 minutes will be communication, because we were talking about communication between two adults, the two parents when talking about divorce, and it's really up to communication. But really, we're talking about communication between three adults.
Right.
So, how does that work with estate planning and existing estates and creating a new estate? How does that work?
So it's interesting to Julie's point, what 17 or 18-year-old going away to college knows what box to check on a healthcare plan. And so one of the biggest things we've done with clients and friends and family is to suggest that the adult child now that's going away to college actually have an agent to be able to act for them. It's not on the top of many of our lists to think that our 18-year-old going away to college or a university needs a power of attorney or needs a medical directive to put a parent in place to actually call a doctor or call the school. But it's been interesting to now have clients revisit that with their children. And we are meeting with a lot of 18-year-olds who are sitting in their dorm rooms now talking about how they need to have a power of attorney to designate one or both parents. Or some of them don't want their parent to be making that decision, who they would want. So it's very interesting when you say, how do they make these decisions? Well, a lot of them need to have the documents in place to have a parent call XYZ organization or have the medical directive in place so they can call the doctor and figure out what insurance covers what or so forth. And so estate planning takes on two phases at this point, which is the 18-year-old going away to school needs basic documents. It may not need a will, but They may need a power of attorney simply to designate an agent. They may need a medical directive, or even as simply a healthcare agent to not make all of the decisions, but at least give a parent or both parents or a sibling the ability to, call the health suite at the school and say, I heard that there's a fever and what's the diagnosis? It can be as simple as that.
So let's take a step back and kind of define those terms for a second. We've talked about a power of attorney, a will, and a medical directive. I think we all kind of generally know what a will is, but power of attorney, we've heard that term. Well, we know that term as attorneys, but I'm speaking on behalf of our attendees.
Absolutely.
We probably heard that term. What does that mean specifically, and how does that work?
I think the simplest way to think about it in this context is how to put somebody into your shoes to be able to make the decisions that you would make on a day-to-day basis with regard to everything but medical decisions. Mm-hmm. We don't have to get into the technical definitions of everything in the document as we sit here today, but really big picture, how do we put someone in place to call the bank if you want to go to a bank account that your child has while they're away at school and move money or deposit money or make a change? How do we call a credit card company if all of a sudden there was a charge at an off-campus place that their credit card may have gotten stolen? How does the parent contact that organization? With regards to the medical side of things, the power of attorney is only going to cover financial type services in your day-to-day activity. The medical is carved out in a separate document, and different jurisdictions are going to call it different things, but you may have what's called a medical directive. You may have what's called a living will to some degree. You may have what's called a healthcare power of attorney. It just depends. But the big picture is putting an agent in place to talk to a doctor, talk to a medical professional about anything. We all know what HIPAA is, and it authorizes certain disclosures on that front. So you have these pieces with regards to your child, but then you also have to revisit, my child is now out of the house at school. How does that impact the bigger picture of our plan as the parents? Which is a loaded question, and one that certainly could take the whole hour of this presentation. But one of the biggest things is all of us start to talk about as our kids are growing and getting older, what role do they start to play in our documents as they are this adult? Do they become your agent as a power of attorney? Do they become your agent on the medical side of things? And I think what the considerations have to be is, well, they're away at school now. If something happens to me, are they going to be able to be available? Are they going to be able to take on that burden? And so I think it's thinking of it from the control aspect of who's making decisions, and then also looking at it from the perspective of, well, now that they're at school, now that they are this adult, how are they receiving things potentially in my document, and is that sufficient now? Should they be controlling it, or should somebody else be controlling it? And so it is a good opportunity to revisit, review, and make sure that everything is in line with where we are. And one of the biggest things too is our kids go everywhere. They could be going to any state. Some could be going out of the country. And so all the laws are going to be different in different jurisdictions. And I know when I was at school, I wasn't allowed to have a vehicle, for example, or things of that nature. But looking at how, for example, do you need a state-specific power of attorney to deal with things? Or do I need special documentation, title, or otherwise for a vehicle? And how that's impacted by the state-specific laws, which leads into my question, which is, if I do take a car with me or things of that nature, what do I need to be worried about in that sense?
And that's the $1 million question, literally, when it comes to covering your child when they go to college. We have health insurance, we have homeowners insurance, we've got car insurance, auto insurance, and we have an umbrella insurance policy that's available for
Is that for a rainy day?
It could be.
Okay.
And I think it's a dual answer there. It's not only does it,
day no one wants to have.
it protects you in a bad day, and it also covers everything else. It can tie in different types of coverage if there might be a gap. Let me give you an example. Let's say your child goes to college and They have insurance on the car. They have a car that they took to college. It's insured. It's titled in their name. It's insured in their name. You, as their parent, you have homeowners insurance. You have health insurance, as Julie talked about. They might have two health insurance policies. They might have the campus health insurance policy, and they're still on your policy because they're under 26. But does that necessarily cover every scenario that it might be in if, God forbid, they're liable for an accident? They get into an accident, or if they're injured in an accident. The answer is not always. That's why an umbrella policy is important. An umbrella policy, you can do a couple of things. It could bring in coverage from you as the parent if your child's in an automobile collision. If for some reason there's something wrong with the insurance, they're not driving their car, they're driving somebody else's car. They might not be covered by an insurance policy in the vehicle they're driving, but they might still be covered under your insurance if there's an umbrella policy in place. There's on the other side of it, if for some reason if your child is possibly at fault in a collision and they are insured, but their coverage isn't as robust as it needed to be for the damages that they may have caused, an umbrella policy can help with that. So I think the first answer is, do you have an umbrella policy? You might have a homeowner's insurance policy. You might have auto insurance. You might have auto insurance. Are you tied together with an umbrella policy?
If parents have an umbrella policy as part of their portfolio of insurance, is it a major issue if the child goes out of state with regards to that policy?
It could be, but probably not. One of the things you want to make sure you look at
Isn't that controlled ultimately by the insurance policy at issue? The umbrella policy
Exactly.
isn't. So in that regard, the first place is to turn the parent to turn back and look at the existing coverage to make sure, one, that it contemplates this child being out of state, being away at college. So some of it is driven by the documents.
Absolutely.
What about, Adam asked about the student that has a car at campus. It's not unusual for freshmen to not be permitted to have a car on campus. In that instance, does the child, what considerations, if any, does the parent need to have when their child is living on campus, but they do not have a car? Do they still need to be covered by insurance, or are we safe until they get home for the summer?
One of the things I encourage parents to do with their now adult child, and this is a good way to introduce your adult child into adulthood, because there are certain things that just aren't fun, and one of them is going over insurance policies. Sit down with your soon-to-be college freshman, or if you already have a child that's in college, sit down with them when they're home and go over the coverage that your family has. And like you said, it's document-driven. What is the insurance company contracted to protect you from? So sit down and go over it, and go over it yourselves without your children if you can. Know what you are covered. Is there a question that we've gotten before is, I have insurance, it's great where I am, but my kid's on the other side of the country and they don't have some of the insurance providers that we have here that I know are covered. Well, in a lot of situations with insurance coverage, the plan that you have might extend to carriers or providers you might not be aware of. Go through your explanation of benefits. Every policy has an explanation of benefits. Go through all their providers, all the carriers, and see what is covered. And then plug in the holes if you need to plug them in. And you do that with your child. Here's your insurance card. Me, as your mother, as your father, I've been holding on to your insurance card for the first 17 years, 364 days of your life. this is your insurance code. You need to hold on to it. You probably, since you were 16, already know where your auto insurance covers. But did you know we have a homeowner's policy? This is what the homeowner's policy covers. Did you know we also have an umbrella insurance coverage, which means all of our policies are brought in under this protective umbrella. But not everything. This is what it's covered. This is what isn't covered. It really is, like you said, document driven. But knowing the questions to ask when it comes to coverage is going to help you answer those questions.
And is it also, to Adam's point, in revisiting the estate plan, based on the degree of maturity and the decision making of their individual child, along with whatever the portfolio, the financial circumstances are for the family, that would certainly drive a lot of the conversation to the extent there is transparency or opaqueness by the parents. Fair to say?
Absolutely. In fact, I would go a step further and say that conversation, while should be couched in the in the way you converse with your child, what your comfort level is with discussing these issues with them, but also understand that there is a legal responsibility that your child now has to follow because they're 18 and they're considered an adult. So even if it's something that they don't necessarily want to take the time to talk about, finding a way to discuss issues, these issues that we're talking about, your family plan, your the estate plan, what kind of insurance coverage you have in some form. Maybe it's a communication via email with your child. That could be just as fruitful because something you can go back to and point to and say, remember, this might be something that you can hold on to and discuss in the future. Maybe you don't. You've got a lot going on. You're moving into your dorm. You're maybe leaving state. Maybe you're just going down the street, but you want to have some independence. A lot going on for 18.
Sure.
There's nothing better than explaining to a 17, 18, 19-year-old how they've become an adult and what they now have to do to get them to then sign their power of attorney. Not a better conversation to have. Then everybody ends up in the office and on fall break signing their power of attorney and going back to school feeling much more confident that their parents can still handle things for them, which many of you parents may not want. But
and the other piece of that is also looking to their child's particular university or college that they're attending to make sure it satisfies whatever concerns the particular institution has. They may have specific forms they want the student and their parent to complete with regards to particularly healthcare information, because the university cannot provide that information unless there is specific authorization by the student. Right?
Correct.
And in the same way with the car accident that hopefully does not occur, but the police are not going to be calling the parent. The student will be dealing with that issue on their own unless there's something already in place to allow for access to information, and their now adult student is dealing with these adult real world issues really on their own.
And if your child gets into an accident or gets in trouble with the law when they're in college, you as a parent might be the third or fourth or fifth person to get contact the university, might contact a representative of their housing facility, on-campus medical director, and then the parent,
Right.
if they even have that information.
But to that point, one thing that's important that we try to remind people of, and it can be difficult, is to create a card. It can be like a business card, it can be something you can laminate it, whatever it is, to have key people on it and to have your child keep it in their wallet. Because if they're in that car accident, if something happens to them and that is located, then there's kind of a beacon to call.
That's a
great point.
That's a great idea. That's a great point. So let's talk about something that is weighing on everybody's minds as it pertains to the questions that came in beforehand. 529 plans. So I'm going to start with you, Julie. What is the benefit of having a 529 plan? plan. Maybe just give us the basics on why a family might have a 529 plan and how it works.
Well, a 529 plan is essentially a specific savings account for the purpose of education. You can put in money that's tax deferred. And so the benefit is you are ideally saving early on for that child, so that once they start college, you have money set aside that can then be paid hopefully directly to the institution to defray costs associated with tuition, really all education expenses. And
so it's not just tuition, but books. Does it cover housing, and what other kind of costs would it cover?
Well, really, any of that educational costs, you would have to look at. There are different plans that will cover things, and then also Adam can speak really more to the tax implications than I and what's covered. From my vantage point, one of the important things to think about in the context of separation and divorce is when there are already existing 529 plans at the time of divorce. In Maryland, if the practice of the parties has been those 529 plans really were used for the stated purpose of educational expenses associated with their children, then they are considered to be property of the child rather than part of the marital estate. And so that can be relevant in the context of what courts may do. But in terms of a marital settlement agreement, it's important that that information is contained in the marital settlement agreement and with the disposition of the 529 plan is going to be and how those funds are used. And then if there are 529 plans that have been identified in a marital settlement agreement, oftentimes that's going to be information that is necessary that the university has. It is not unusual when you're applying for things like financial aid. You're doing the FAFSA, which everybody has to do. It's a federal form. If you're interested in any kind of financial assistance from the university or on a federal level, it's a standard form that has to be completed, and it is not unusual for universities to ask for documentation like the existence of a marital settlement agreement or the existence of an alimony order or child support, as they fold all of that into sort of the financial consideration in terms of financial aid. But then in terms of thinking about it from the estate plan and for the tax, because there are strategic ways to use it from a tax perspective. Is that right, Adam?
That's correct. It's part of an overall portfolio that anyone's going to share with their accountant, with their financial advisor, and with their attorney as part of the overall planning process. And so when you look at the 529 plan, there's certain things that jump out to a planner when we're looking at that. Number one is the beneficiary information correct. You want to make sure that everything is correct in there for your child and that they are under the right plan for you. You've consulted with an accountant, you've consulted with your advisor to make sure that you're aware that, for example, Maryland has 2 different plans, Virginia has different plans. So depending on where you're giving, if there's a grandparent that's giving, different areas can have different tax implications that could benefit, or it could be of no benefit, but they're going to be different in jurisdictions. So you want to look at the beneficiary information to make sure that's clear. You want to look at if, God forbid, something happened to anyone who was owning one of these 529 plans, there is the ability to designate a successor owner. And so that should be considered because oftentimes the 529 plan or things of that nature can be considered an asset of the estate if someone were to pass away, and then they're distributed to whoever the beneficiary might be. And so that could fall into the hands of someone who may not be contributing or administering it. And so you want to think through those various contingencies if something like that were to happen.
So can I ask you a clarifying question on that?
Yes.
So in terms of, if the beneficiary that's been identified and then the owner passes away, the funds then go to the beneficiary if the beneficiary does not administer or pay the money consistent with that particular child, are they then losing does the adult child lose the benefit as a consequence of the owner's death, and now the money is controlled by the beneficiary? Or are the beneficiary still required to use it for an educational purpose for the designated adult child?
So let's take one step back. When we're using the term beneficiary, I think we're talking about the beneficiary under a will or testamentary device that's going to receive the ownership of this plan, not the beneficiary of the actual 529 plan. So the short answer is it depends on the plan, right? Certain plans are really locked in for you must use it for this. Other plans are somewhat investment in nature, where it's more open-ended as to what you can use it for. And so I think that's where it plays into what's your overall financial plan with all of this. Is it an investment tool that's for a more wide range of things for the beneficiary of the 529 plan? Or is it very specific as to, I'm giving this money locked in to be paid just for books and tuition and things of that nature? So I think a lot of that depends on the plan itself.
And interrupt you on that. For our viewers then, where do they go to figure out that answer for their already existing 529 plans as they currently exist?
I think the good news is that a lot of the literature on those plans, I have little kids, so I have read it thoroughly as to where I'm putting my money for the 529 plan and what's going to happen to it. I think the literature is very good online to the various websites where you're going to donate and going to administer that money. But your financial advisor who you're working with long term should be able to explain that and give you the pros and cons of what you're doing. And again, your accountant can give you the tax implications too of each of those different mechanisms, because you're going to need to understand that it's not just I take $10,000 and put it in the 529 plan and that's it. There are gifting considerations to all of that. And so that needs to be
Such
reviewed.
as what?
Such as any monies gifted to a 529 plan, transferred to a 529 plan, are just that. They're a gift. And so we as individuals all have an annual exclusion each year. And a lot of times we're gifting money that falls under that limit, which is currently $16,000 per person.
Meaning that if you make a gift to an individual for less than whatever the amount is, it's tax-free. You don't
Correct.
have to.
Correct. So if I deposit $10,000 into each one of my kids' 529 plans, I don't have a tax implication there. I'm using up my annual exclusion. And if I give further to them over and above that, I may have exceeded that annual exclusion, which may not mean I have to pay tax, but it may mean I have to file a return. Again, something we keep our accountants informed about.
It may have other tax implications.
Correct. And so it also gets you thinking of what are the alternatives too. I can fully fund my 529 plan and make sure that as I, have my child going away to college, that I'm using it for the right things, and we want to use that up. But it's also a good time to call the grandparents and call the cousins and talk about how sometimes direct payments to an educational institution aren't gifts. If I have a grandparent that's going to, spoil my child and pay tuition, them cutting a check directly to the institution likely isn't going to have any gift tax implications. And so that's something that's a tax-free way of gifting. And there are other certain exclusions to that.
So but to clarify that in terms of tax-free, the tax-free gifting, they're paying, in that scenario, they're paying that bill with post-tax dollars though.
Correct.
And so for the family unit that's thinking about whether to do that, it's a consideration of, is it better to put the money into a 529 plan using pre-tax dollars versus paying the bill as it comes due? with post-tax dollars. And then, of course, whatever their financial circumstances are at the time, and the tax brackets they find themselves in, all of that would be relevant in the consideration for the family at that time.
Short answer is yes. The longer answer is all of us sitting here and all of us listening know that more likely than not, the funds of the 529 plan and where education costs are probably aren't going to fully fund that education. So having both components is the best of both worlds, so to speak. So yes, to your point, there are tax benefits using the after-tax dollars, and there's tax benefits to deferring some of that and using it, whether it's through the 529 plan or other vehicles that fit within each one of our portfolios.
Switching gears a little bit here, we've talked about planning for the future, kind of looking in the past, what you've already set up, like at 529, might have been around for a while. But let's talk about, what if your child is going to college in the middle of a divorce? What are some of the, how do you plan for that? How do you plan for the contingencies? I know there's no one answer to cover that, but if you're in the middle of a divorce and you're applying for and planning for college, what happens if one of the parents isn't as forthcoming with this information we've been talking about? They're a beneficiary on a 529, or at least their parents are. They're the conduit for that, or they're on an insurance policy. How do you handle that?
It can have a serious implication for your adult child. If it will depend on any number of things, but where it will directly impact on the child is the child's ability to obtain financial aid, because universities, the FAFSA form, which is the federal financial aid form, they require the income information for each of the parents. And if you have one parent who is not willing to share that information, and the parent who is opaque with that financial information, and the other parent does not have access to that information, or more importantly, their adult child doesn't have access to that information, that can undermine their child's ability to successfully receive financial aid. In that instance, parties may have to get the lawyers involved in an effort to try and obtain the information. Depending on what's contained in the marital settlement agreement, that may impact. It is not unusual where parties contemplate how college expenses are going to be addressed, and that may have a bearing on, to the extent there is financial aid or what a student is eligible for. If this adult student simply is hitting a brick wall in terms of access to information from one parent, a completely uncooperative parent, then that student needs to be very transparent with the school in terms of what they're encountering. It may require the other parent getting assistance from their attorney to advocate on the cooperative parent's behalf, in an effort to try and satisfy what the financial aid information is, or the income information that the student is requesting, so that the adult student can meet whatever the institution's eligibility requirements are to get the information. And then if the child is an adult, however, the adult child will have limited remedies against their parent for the lack of cooperation, which is different than if the child is a minor and the other parent is seeking to intervene on behalf of the child based on the best interests of the child, or based on a breach of an agreement that's in place, or violation of a court order. If the child is aged out, many of those remedies may no longer exist for that aged out child.
Yeah.
And if, unfortunately, if the parent is unwilling, that student is going to have to advocate for themselves with their financial aid office in an effort to see what accommodation, if any, the institution will make, given the uniqueness of the circumstances.
So one of the questions that we've gotten is, and this is a curveball for you.
I love a curveball.
What if you're in the process of getting divorced? You're getting separated. You're putting together a separation agreement or a final decree of divorce. What should a parent be looking for, and what should a now adult child be looking for?
Sure. In terms of the adult child, they are not a party to that. They don't have standing, is the legal term we would use, and even though they are the beneficiary of their parents' agreement, they don't have a right to be involved in any of the discussions, the negotiations, and it's, generally speaking, it's not a good thing for a child, regardless of how old they are, to not be directly involved in the negotiations of the parents. From the parents' perspective, in Maryland, there's no legal obligation to pay for your child's college education. We may feel the moral imperative to pay for our adult child's education. That is an individual decision, and it is not one that Maryland requires parents to pay for college. So, depending on each parent and their willingness to contractually obligate themselves for a voluntary obligation that they would not otherwise have to incur, will impact what goes into a marital settlement agreement as it pertains to college expenses. So even though there's no legal obligation to do it, folks will enter into contracts that define what each parent's obligation, if any, will be as it pertains to college or any kind of post-high school expenses, because even though we're talking about high school, it could certainly be trade school. That's what they called it in my day, technical, vocational school, any of those sorts of things. They're going to be satisfied under 529s. They're going to have a lot of the same issues that we're talking about, even if your student is really not even leaving the nest. So that's all going to be part of the consideration. And certainly to the extent there are already existing plans and provisions that parties have made with regards to 529 plans, existing UTMA accounts, other gifting vehicles that may already exist between the parties, that will all impact what, if anything, would go into their marital settlement agreement as it pertains to college expenses. But certainly if they agree to do college expenses, it certainly would be appropriate to include in there mitigating the possibility of what you just asked,
right,
is what happens if you have the uncooperative parent. You contemplate for, 5 years from now, we are going to have to exchange financial information to help our now adult child obtain financial aid. We are agreeing everybody's going to share that information. So now the parent that is no longer cooperative 5 years hence, the other parent, not the adult student, but the other parent has a means by which they have a vehicle to enforce that and coerce ultimately the conduct of the uncooperative parent for the benefit of the child.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because I think a lot of what you're talking about are these very technical pieces. And I know a lot of what I've touched on are these very technical documents and statements and what does a trust have to say if you want to pay money for this and so forth. And that's a lot of what we do in the day-to-day. And I'm not saying that's not what you do, but An
One meets the road, right?
An interesting question that's been weighing on my mind with your background is, what is the appropriate conversation to have with your child from a life standpoint before they walk out of that house and go to school, or when they come back for their first break, before they go back to, go to a party or do the various things that colleges do? What is that conversation?
That's a question that I get often from our clients. It's a difficult conversation. Even if you're not dealing with these life changes that we're talking about, and the life plans, divorces, if you're not in that situation, it's a conversation everybody needs to have. That's a whole separate topic that we can do, but I think two things that I think would be very important to discuss with your child are, if they're taking a vehicle to college, what is the coverage and how do you protect them and protect yourself and protect your assets? And the second one is, how does your kid stay safe in school? How can you do what you can to make them as safe as they can be in school? To answer the first part of that question, you have two options. If you're sending your kid to school with a car, as many people do, should they be on their own insurance? Should they be on your insurance as a parent? What's the impact of one versus the other? Well, a teenager as a driver is going to have a higher rate than a parent, unless there is, in general.
This is a very bad while driving parent.
There are those out there.
Or a self-driving car, which is in the near future.
Well, maybe they'll be insured as well. The rates are going to go up. If your child is on your insurance and they get into an accident in college, your rates are going to be impacted. But you might be able to have more coverage because you've been driving for X amount of years. I'm not going to answer that question. And they're a newer driver. So more coverage might be available for them at a reasonable rate if they're a part of your insurance. Now, if you send your child to college and you send them to college and they're on their own insurance and they're not domiciled, domicile means they're living on your property with you at home. I don't need to explain that to you. And you send them to college in Maryland, the basic policy will cover $30,000 per person, $60,000 total for multiple people who are injured by your child if they cause a tort, if they cause injury to someone. What happens if it's over that? Well, if they're not if there's no way for your insurance to cover them under that umbrella or under your homeowner's insurance, under your auto insurance, and they have $30,000 in policy coverage, $60,000 max for multiple people who are injured by possible negligence by your child, and there's a judgment or a settlement that goes above and beyond, or a judgment, let's do that, a judgment above and beyond that. That judgment above the $30,000 or $60,000 for multiple injured claimants under that policy, if that judgment, that excess, will be attached to your child for 12 years at least. So that's the downside of kind of excising your child from your financial responsibility. Yes, it's going to protect your assets, but you could be putting them in a financially disadvantaged position if they're in that situation. It's a roll of the dice.
And isn't it also, though, based again on the specific facts and the uniqueness of the particular family situation? So family A, their decisions are going to be driven by all of the financial considerations, plus any of the other sort of soft subjective things, right, that families are thinking about. And that may look very different than family B based on what their priorities are, as well as their particular financial circumstances. And so is it fair to say that's part of why it's really important for the parent to know the information themselves?
Absolutely.
To then have that conversation with their adult child to come up with something that ultimately is protecting the child, protecting the family, and is something everybody feels relatively comfortable, as much as any of us can, as we send our newly adult children off.
As they spread their wings. That's right. Absolutely. And this goes back to our original discussion. Not just laying out the papers and going over it with your child, but knowing what your own policy covers. For many families, their homeowners insurance policy, their umbrella insurance policy, even their auto insurance policy, they might have bought it, signed up for it, and even with their health insurance, might have gotten that all signed up years before they're in this situation. So everything we're talking about might already be covered. Everything we're talking about, you might think you're paying for it, but you're not getting.
Right.
You need to know that before you sit down in front of your child and tell them what their responsibility and their part in this is.
Do you think as part of that, it's important to make the introduction for your adult child to the attorney, the family attorney, an attorney friend, at least so that they have some sort of familiarity with someone they can call if there is one of these problems as they go away to school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's, having someone to bounce these conversations off of. We have each other. We do this every day. Everybody out there doesn't do this every day. They have their own lives. Bouncing these ideas off of each other, knowing what's covered in a 15, 20-page explanation of benefits document is a challenge for many people. And it doesn't really matter based on, on their level of education or their experience with insurance policies or 529 plans. It's something that a lot of people aren't used to. Having someone there to just bounce things off, or wait a second, let me give you a scenario that we're in. And would my child be covered in this situation? How can I have my child covered in this situation?
Well, if you had asked me that question, Adam, in terms of what is your student, your adult student need to know as they go off, my answer is don't call me, call your attorney, because that may be the person, if there's the automobile accident, if there's an issue that the student is facing, they may need to have their own point person, which if their adult child doesn't have a lawyer as a parent, it may very well be somebody that is not the parent to call. So the running joke for my one at college is if you're at a party, things go wrong for you, then this is who you need to be calling. You need to be calling Aron Benjamin. You don't need to be calling me at that point. I'll put my hat on as mom, but if there's a criminal issue that comes up or anything in that world, that's the person you need to be reaching out to first and foremost. And so the parent feeling like they have a comfortable backup plan, right, for their adult student as they go off onto the horizon includes understanding health insurance implications, car insurance implications, estate planning implications, and then hopefully something that none of us ever have to deal with is our adult child having the possibility of needing some other assistance and having their own point person as a lawyer. And they may not feel comfortable asking their parent.
Right, but and recognizing that these issues, as we are here in 2022 and beyond, are way more complicated than we had ever, run into when we were in school, or we were thinking about that, and that the parent may not be the most well-equipped person to answer those questions,
right, needing
a third party to.
And I think to wrap things up, I think there's a couple of themes that we all picked up on here. Communication is huge. And I think What you just brought up, Adam, is really important. It's not a one-time conversation.
Right.
This is an ongoing conversation between parents, between parents and the child, possibly between parents, child, and someone on campus who is responsible, either an RA or someone who's in the with the medical facilities there, depending on your child's needs. Knowing who to talk to and knowing what the questions are is going to significantly increase your ability to protect your child. Once you're there, then you can start personalizing your plan.
And the more your adult child understands the impact, right, how they can be directly impacted, it cultivates the desire in that adult child, notwithstanding their need for independence and their desire for independence, to appreciate that it really is a team approach that all of us, are navigating.
Well, thank you for being with us. My name is Aron Benjamin. On behalf of Julie Christopher and Adam Abramowitz, thank you for taking your time.